Bishop James Connolly serves as the Bishop of Lincoln, Nebraska. He has been a long-time champion of the study of the liberal arts and the ways in which they enlighten both the mind and the soul. He was on campus to offer a lecture for the Sheridan Center for Classical Studies, so I invited him to the studio to continue the discussion on the great books, education, and the human person. Benedictine College is transforming culture in America, one conversation at a time. From our studios in Atchison, Kansas, these are the Benedictine Dialogues. I thought maybe to start off, we could talk a little bit about the state of American education today. Ever since I was a kid, I've been hearing about the crisis of American education, so we're now 40 years into that. But, you know, a lot of new waves have maybe shifted that a little bit. I'd love to hear your perspective on sort of the State of the Union address of like where are we right now as an educational body or entity within the United States?
Well, it's a very good question, and we could spend the whole time talking about the crisis of education. And, you know, it's been going on for more than 40 years. It actually goes back to, you know, I think it goes back to really kind of big shift from, you know, the way education was delivered, let's say, for hundreds of years in the great liberal arts tradition. And in the last 100 years, education, I think, has become very, at least in the Western world, and at least in the United States, maybe not so much in Europe, but a very highly pragmatic and utilitarian approach to education. That basically schools were to train young people for the workforce. And that's not, maybe I'm overstating that, but, you know, basically a very career-oriented education. I mean, we live in a democracy, a capitalistic democracy, and so, you know, we're kind of trained to be productive, right? And so in order to have a productive society, people have to be trained in different areas and then bring those skills to the general marketplace and to have a career. And so that's, I think, that's been sort of the philosophy of education over the last, let's say, 100 years. And with this sort of highly pragmatic, you know, John Dewey, John Stuart Mill, some of the great leaders of utilitarianism. With that, I think what happened in education is it became sort of disintegrated as opposed to integrated, so that we were basically dividing up all the subjects and topics to their own special areas and losing kind of a sense of the whole. You know, how do these things connect? What does it mean to be an educated person? You know, I mean, you can be really specialized in one area, a tremendous mathematician, which is great, or a physicist, or you know, a linguist, but to, you know, look at the educated person as someone who has a broad understanding of the whole of education or the whole of learning, and how these different subjects all fit together to form someone who is truly kind of steeped in the kind of, I should say, classical understanding of the educated person. What Newman, let's say John Henry Newman, back in the middle of the 19th century, and the Oxford movement was all about, and that is, you know, the formation of someone and intellectually, but not just intellectually, but also the heart, to form the virtuous person. A specialization, that can come along as well. But I think the crisis really has been this kind of disintegration and sort of fragmentation of education, so that we're all sort of in our own lanes and our own silos, and becoming experts in particular fields, which is, we need experts in fields. But sure. I see this happening also to medicine. You know, there's so much specialization in the area of medicine and healthcare. To have somebody who's just sort of a general practice doc. You know, there are fewer and fewer, yeah. And I think we all should be certain general practice docs. You know, we all should have a broad understanding of everything. But that's been lost, I think. That should be the basis and foundation of all education. And then, yeah, maybe go into specialty areas. But it seems like we start to specialize from, you know, kindergarten.
Yes. Do you think, so I'm with Mortimer Adler, that even our farmers should be reading Aristotle, right?
Yeah.
But I wonder if that was a shift in the understanding of human nature that occurred maybe 100 years ago, or if it was more of a sociological concern of what's really best for society. And if you're a utilitarian, it's going to be good workers who can produce things that make money, versus an understanding of the human nature and what's good for the human person. Do you think that was part of the shift that happened in those philosophers or in that movement of John Dewey and the like?
Well, I think a lot of it was driven by, sort of the capitalistic, idea of consumerism and production, and the Industrial Revolution and workers and careers and those kinds of things. And the idea, too, that the good life equates with wealth, and that money really is the main pursuit, and someone who is able to have a career where they can earn a lot of money. That's sort of the recipe for the good life or the happy life. Well, we know that's not true, because we know a lot of millionaires that are terribly unhappy and miserable. So I think that's part of it. That's part of what's led to it, is this sort of understanding that, well, if I can just make a lot of money, I'll be happy. And therefore, I got to get the best job that will make me that money. And then other things, too, I think kind of a losing our way, and this is more philosophical, losing our way as far as what really brings about purpose and meaning in life. What is the good life? What does make someone happy? What is the recipe for happiness? And I think that has to do with a virtue, living a virtuous life, learning how to grow in virtue, magnanimity, to be magnanimous and not turned on yourself, but turned towards others, because we know that that's really the best version of ourselves, are those, who go out of themselves to help others and have this sort of desire to bring joy and hope to others around you, not just being self-centered. And I think part of the education we receive does sort of tend to kind of default to self-centeredness and that competition to make as much money as we can, and we lose the sense of the whole, of what it is that education should be forming us toward.
So I'd love to hear your answer then to naysayers that think, well, then why should we read things that are 3,000 years old? Why what does Homer have to do with that?
Yeah. Well, I think we have to recognize that wisdom, and really that's what we're talking about, is you can have a lot of knowledge and we can be very academically, have a lot of information in our brains, but that's data that's really there to make us wise, and wisdom is partly a gift from God, but also the wise man or the wise woman has this broad understanding of reality, of the world and of relationships and of human emotions and of virtue and all these things. And so the great thinkers of our whole tradition, going back to Homer, have written about what it is that makes us virtuous. What is goodness, truth, and beauty, and how is that manifested in the lives of these great figures? And that's why, a character like Odysseus, in his journey, from the Trojan Wars back to his home in Ithaca, and everything that happens, it's like a little microcosm of life, and how he's a coward sometimes, and how he's selfish sometimes, but at other times he overcomes his selfishness, overcomes his cowardness and fear, and becomes heroic. And so just take that one example of the Odyssey. You have all the virtues and all the vices, of life. And those kinds of things never change. That's 3,000 years old, but things haven't changed too much since then. And then everything since then, whether it be the rest of the Greek, thinkers, or into Roman or Western civilization, the plays of Shakespeare, there's probably no better author who understood human nature than William Shakespeare. And he portrays it in an artistic way through plays and through poetry, but really plays are poetry, which really paints a picture in the imagination of truth, goodness, and beauty as it's played out, as it's played out and acted in these wonderful plays that have stood the test of time. And then, even that's primarily fiction, although he had historical plays as well, but great literature and art and poetry also appeal to the imagination and are able to lead people to higher things. Because most of the great books and the great works of literature and art and music lift us up to greater things. They really do kind of elevate the human soul. And that's why I think those are perennial. And are there modern authors that are doing the same thing? Yeah, I think there are. But we'll know if they last, if people are reading them in 100 years from now. But we know that people have been reading these authors for hundreds and hundreds of years, and they continue to have relevancy even today, even though they're in the past.
Yeah, I really like the term the great conversation, that it's a conversation amongst human beings about the greatest things of what it means to be a human person, right? Which includes God, which includes earth and science and the like. So that when it comes to modern authors, the question is, well, what do they compare in regard to the great conversation? How are they participating in the great conversation? So the invitation to partaking to that conversation, to me, that is an invitation to wonder. It's an invitation to seeing the higher things. So when you remove that, which is, I think, the crisis of American education today, you're no longer looking up. Yeah. And then all of a sudden there's a lot of psychological problems, but also sociological problems that you end up running into, because now we're not all looking up to something higher than ourselves. We're all now looking at each other. And that can cause some sociological issues as well.
Right. No, that's really well put. We're not asking those questions because we don't even look up to ask those questions. We don't even know those questions. We can't even formulate those questions because our horizons have been we're so flat-souled that we don't aspire to something great. And if the human spirit doesn't even look up, it's you sort of settle into this mediocrity, which is really lessens the dignity of a human being, and so they have nothing to live for, and nothing sort of to give themselves to. If their horizons have been lowered so much. And then I think that's where despair sits in, because, you look around, and if you're not looking anything beyond what you see, and after a while you just get tired of what the world has to offer. And then you finally say, are you kidding me? Is this all there is? And then you begin to say, well, gosh, it's not even worth living, and I think that's why suicide is up, and those kinds of things, because they're not asking those questions which can lift them up beyond, to the greatness that we're all called to.
Mm-hmm. You see it reflected as well in modern arts and culture. Especially in the movie industry right now, it's just constant remakes of things, or a part 6 of a film that doesn't really have a narrative to add to it. Same thing in music. A lot of it is it's very uninspired. It's almost as if we're living off the last fumes of whatever what wonder used to exist there. And so you end up with a situation where now it's just about money making. So in the movie industry, for example, they don't want to take risks anymore because they don't want to make a film that they might lose money on because they know a remake is going to fill in that nostalgia for something that happened 20 to 60 years ago. And people go to theaters for that, but unfortunately that removes the artist. It removes the magnanimity, really, is what it is, the great souledness of a good artist.
Right. And the creativity that's, that can be unleashed into taking that risk. And maybe it'll flop, it could, but, we won't know until they actually try, until someone tries, to do that. And it's a shame if that's not being cultivated in the arts. You see it break through. I mean, every now and then there's some great movie comes out and it really strikes the chord. But then they make 6 other ones trying to recreate it,
Exactly.
and they make a lot of money on those sequels.
Yes.
But yeah, it's well put.
I always say that It's a Wonderful Life also flopped when it first came out. So
Yeah.
now it's a classic of American film. So I wanted to hear a little bit about your experience at KU, at Kansas University, at the Integrated Humanities program there. Of course, John Sr. is very much in the language here at our Center for Classics, as well as the Great Books program. I'd love to hear a little bit about your experience there, how that impacted you, and how it's kind of still influencing you.
Sure, it's I think about it a lot because it shaped my whole. It first of all transformed my life. It changed my life, but it also continues to change my life. I mean, it's one of those things that I continue to go back to as I get older and older. To appreciate the remarkable thing that happened. I mean, and this program, when you talk about it, people think, "Oh, this sounds like it's a, sort of an advanced studies for, for the very gifted and for the very, talented or intellectual academic." No, we were very ordinary students and very sort of not a very good education. I had a kind of a very, very, I think, poor public education and this was a time of experimentation in the schools in the 70s, and there was really not much substance in what I learned in my elementary and high school years. And then when I came to the University of Kansas and got into this program, the Integrated Humanities program, for the first time, I was introduced to these great ideas, and they were presented in such a way that they were master teachers, so they really were skilled at their trade and their craft. So they were able to teach these, they were able to unpack these great books. But, it wasn't primarily an intellectual journey. It was a journey of the heart. Because in addition to what we were reading, and they were great books, but also there were friendships that were starting to form among the students. And they were appealing to the imagination more than the head, the heart more than the head. And there was a lot of music in the air. For example, in addition to the weekly lectures that we had on Tuesdays and Thursdays for 90 minutes, there was 1 hour set aside in smaller groups. This was in a big lecture hall, maybe 150 students during the lectures. But in the smaller groups, like 1 hour a week, we would just memorize poetry. And one of the things and I didn't know what the heck I was memorizing. I didn't know, I'd never memorized a poem in my life. And they just said, no, just repeat. And so they were just filling our imaginations with verse. And that verse stays with you, and it becomes part of you. Every lecture, for example, began with a song. And then usually an upperclassman would come out for maybe 5 minutes and teach a song. So you were learning a whole repertoire of music at the same time and poetry. Then there would be, every other week we would go out and we would learn the constellations of the stars and how that kind of fit into the mythology we were reading in the first year, which was all pagan literature. And so all of these things combined, that's why they call it the Integrated Humanities program. It all combined, and they taught it in a different way than most people were teaching the great books. They employed what they called the poetic mode of learning, where they really kind of, instead of, they pointed to things instead of teaching things. In other words, they showed us things instead of teaching us things. So and that engaged the students to embark and to learn. And they had that gift of leading you to the thing itself and then letting you discover it, yourself. And there was a real strong emphasis on what Dr. Senior would call the really real, the really real, to have an encounter with reality. He said, man was made for the stars, but rooted in the soil. And so it's not just ideas, that's all in your head, but it's in real experiences that you have in friendship, in music, in travel. There were travel parts of the program, outdoor fairs, waltzing. The highlight of the year was a spring waltz where the students would organize it themselves, hire the university orchestra, rent out the university ballroom, and of course, none of us knew how to waltz. So we had to go through this long, elaborate 2-month, learning how to waltz and without being a klutz. So you'd get this dance card, and you'd have these 3 or 4 dances, and you'd have to go, and then you'd have the names of these ladies, and you'd have to find out who they were, and they'd escort them out on the dance floor and dance this, 10, 12 minutes Straussian waltz, and then escort them back. And the purpose of that was to really teach the men to be gentlemen and the women to be ladies. And just that whole kind of formal beauty of the body, the dancing. Simple. I mean, waltzing is not difficult, but you've got to learn it, and then to be able to listen to the music and allow the music to move your body. It was just a transforming experience. Not to mention romantic.
Yes.
A lot of romances were born out of those waltzes.
Sure. That also, I love the integration of dancing, because I think part of what we've lost in American culture is the idea of ritual when it comes to the relationship between men and women, especially at that age. There's no understanding of this is what you're supposed to do when you show up. It's just, we just show up, you know, and we don't really have dances anymore. We just kind of jive around, and there's not really a clear, this is what you're supposed to do. And so what ends up happening is you have awkwardness between the sexes at that point, right? That's what happens. But I remember when I was introduced to some of these works, it was my senior year of high school. It was the first time I had ever read any Shakespeare. We had a new professor show up at our high school. He was actually an atheist, but just deeply loved, the old books. So I read Shakespeare for the first time from a guy who loved them. Mm-hmm. And I remember being kind of angry, because I was like, where has this been?
Why didn't somebody tell me about this?
Exactly. So then I got introduced to Cicero, and then I got introduced to, the Stoics, and it just opened up my eyes in a whole new way. And I legitimately remember being kind of angry, of like, I cannot believe this was taken from me. And I think that people are kind of waking up to the fact that something was taken from us. Something that you're talking about, this integration of the whole person, was taken away from our culture. And so because of that, we're all kind of just seeking meaning in these like very disparate things, especially money. I mean, money is by far possibly the most meaningless thing. We need it. It's a necessary evil, but like, it's not going to give you a good life, So a lot of people that I've been able to kind of introduce to these works, it's a similar experience of they're like, why did it take me 30 years to ever actually open up Homer? And it's a sad thing, because they should have gotten this much earlier, but it's also a very beautiful thing to see it introduced to their life, because it's like, guess what? Now for the rest of your life, you have friends to turn to in these works that will give you a good life and help you better understand yourself, your relationships, your work, your relationship with God. And so to me, it's like, this could be one of the most important things we could do. And I love what you're doing at your diocese with this, and tell me a little bit more about it, of introducing the humanities during the year of the Jubilee. I think that's such a beautiful way to integrate that into our faith life. Tell me a little bit more about the idea behind
the humanities syllabus.
Yes.
Yeah, we're taking each month and introducing a theme, and then kind of showcasing a great work of literature, poetry, music, art, and film. And they're loosely connected, but it's an opportunity to kind of cast out for people to consider to get together and read as let's say a book club, or go to a film together, or go to a play together, or memorize a poem together, to really bring people together around these great examples of truth, goodness, and beauty in our tradition. And you mentioned something too, and Benedictine College, I think, is really one of these examples of where you are, providing a very good education. And it's a holistic education, because you have a very good business school, you have a very good architecture school, you have, nursing, all these kind of practical skills that will get you jobs, which is important, But at the same time, they're totally immersed into the tradition, the great books and the great ideas, so that the conversations that take place in the dormitories like this one, are all kind of elevated because everybody's reading the same things. And it's you've created an atmosphere, a community of learning where really full human potential can flourish. What is it? St. Irenaeus said that God's glory is man fully alive. And that's what we're trying to do in education, is to tap into that potential that everyone has in their own hearts and in their own minds, and to create an atmosphere, a community where that can flourish. And it's not easy because, in this technocracy in which we live, everything works against that holistic, right? Everything works against that integrated approach. I use the example of, I did my pastoral letter, it's like what we've done to children is we've given them a 10,000-piece jigsaw puzzle, but we haven't given them the picture on the box. So they have all these little pieces, and they're trying to put these pieces together to find out how the whole fits in, how it works. Whereas here, you've got a lot of the pieces, right? But there's an integration. There's an integrative principle of how these things all work together, whether it be in the STEM courses, or it's in literature or fine arts or music, and it all is of one piece. It's all of a whole.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we really aim to form students to go out into the world and be successful in their fields and whatever they want to accomplish in the world, but to live the good life ultimately, to really aim towards your relationship with God, your relationship with your family, to really be a good citizen, not to just focus on success, but not that success is a bad thing. Success is a very good thing, and we want good Catholic people going out there being successful in the world. But we also understand that there's an aspect of human nature that's not going to be happy if that's the only thing you're going after. And I think that's where a lot of, especially in the larger public schools, stuff like that, that's just completely missing. They don't understand real human nature in that sense.
It's interesting because I went to a big secular public university, and so religion could not be taught formally, and it wasn't. In fact, the professors, when everybody started converting to the Catholic faith, the professors themselves were accused of proselytizing at a state university. And there were actually hearings on campus, because this was a time when the cults, like the Moonies and the Hare Krishnas, and so this was another cult, Catholic cult. And but those hearings, for one, made the program even more popular because it was controversial. But two, it was obvious from the very beginning that the professors took great pains not to do anything like that. They were just simply teaching the great ideas in literature and art and music and poetry and architecture. And then it was the students who began to connect the dots, to see, well, gosh, there's something in common here. And for me, for example, I wasn't even, I suppose I was a happy agnostic when I came up to the university in the early 70s, and I wasn't an atheist, but I didn't really believe much about if there was a God and where that God was. But through the course of the studies, these big questions, like, is there a God? What is goodness? What is evil? What is love? What is justice? What is honor? All those questions which come up in the book, I began to ask myself, gosh, these are big questions. What do I think about these things? I believe these things. And if I do, well, where does that lead me? And finally, after a couple years, halfway through my junior year, I was received into the Catholic faith and became a Catholic. And because I saw that in the Catholic Church, you found the fullness of truth, goodness, and beauty, lived out in the tradition, both intellectual, but also throughout history. And at the same time, too, lived out in the lives of the saints. You saw the greatest saints, like St. Augustine, like the Confessions of St. Augustine had a huge impact, which we read as literature. We didn't read that as religion, theology. There wasn't a theology book for us. We read it as the life of this great figure in history. St. Thomas Aquinas, these great saints, that St. Francis of Assisi, who were heroic characters, who were, very influential in their own particular time of life and in their own time of history, but it had an impact on the world. And that's what really kind of led me to look to what's behind all this. What motivated this? I mean, what motivated a Mozart to compose this such beautiful music, or a Raphael to paint like this, or a Da Vinci to how or Chartres or Notre Dame? How did they build these things? What inspired them? It was something beyond mechanics. It was a sacramental imagination, and they were able to see that God, has His fingerprints in everything, in His hands in everything, and they were trying to, these people who were gifted with genius were able to, whether it be in literature or poetry or music or architecture, they were able to kind of manifest this beauty in human achievement.
Yes. Yeah, and I think that's the beauty of these programs. It's the beauty of the growing of the classical movement, I think, within the United States, is that's what we want to inspire. Is people who want to do great things, and greatness on a very different level than we might name it today. And so I always say that the Great Books is part of a new rebellion. We're trying to go, it's a rebellion to an old way, an old tradition, but it's rebelling against a modern culture that wants to flatten us out.
Right.
Well, Bishop, thank you so much. This has been a wonderful conversation. Thank you for everything you do. And of course, thank you for coming to Benedictine College.
Thank you for having me on. Appreciate it.
Wonderful. We hope you enjoyed the Benedictine Dialogues, a production of Benedictine College in Atchison, Kansas. To catch all the latest and support our growing platform, visit media.benedictine.edu. And be sure to recommend this show to your friends and family. Help us to transform culture in America, one conversation at a time.